They weren't just friends, they were good friends. They met almost 30 years ago in Texas. They were both working at a mobile gas station. John Green ultimately became an assistant manager and then the store manager. And Mark Coster was one of his clerks. Not only did they work together, but they also lived together when they were in Texas. It was about 2.5 years. The first part of that, about 6 months of that, they lived under the same roof. You'll hear about that. After that, Mark Coster had a mobile home trailer. It was on a piece of property that John Green owned. John had his own trailer. Mark had his own trailer, but they saw each other quite frequently. They shared some similar interests, fishing being one of them, sports. What you're going to hear from John Green, both in his interview and when he testifies, is that Mark also had some mental health problems. That's the best way to put it. And the state mentioned that in their opening statement, that in 1990, Mark was diagnosed with chronic paranoid schizophrenia. Now, John Green, when he meets him, they're working together and living together. He doesn't necessarily know the actual diagnosis, but you're going to hear him say, and maybe it's not politically correct terms when the officers interview him. You know, the best way for him to describe it, and the way to frankly describe it, was Mark was crazy. He had a different way of looking at things. He had certain things that he was paranoid about, certain things that affected his behavior. And, you know, none of this really comes into a lot of relevance until much later, obviously. After a few years, John Green ends up getting a job back in Florida from Texas. He goes back there, lives for a while. Mark Coster suddenly shows up on his door, essentially, unannounced, looking for a job, and you'll hear that the relationship between the two of them, it was a good relationship. John Green liked Mark as far as an employee goes. Mark was a smart person. He was good with numbers. And as a cashier, that's a good thing. He's going to tell you, John will tell you, that his system of working the register was somewhat messy, somewhat sloppy. And Mark would be defensive about that. He'd be very defensive. If somebody tried to tell him the way to do certain things, he would get very upset with that. You're going to hear that persists in his life. And that's relevant when we talk about how this all came to happen. But in any event, they worked together again in Florida. And after that, Mark moves to Arkansas. And they really don't see each other for quite some time. It's around the year 2000 when they reconnect, sort of by phone and email. It's still an easy friendship, I would say. They get along well. And there's sort of a standing offer for John to come on up and see Mark, come on up to Iowa at some point. Well, in the early part of 2009, you're going to hear John Green tell you that he had some stressful things going on in his life. His wife had been diagnosed with cancer. He was having some financial troubles, like many people around the time of the recession. He was stressed out, and the way that he decided that he would deal with that is to just sort of go up and visit Mark. He didn't tell his family where he was going. He just went up to visit Mark and ended up staying approximately 2 months. He was paying Mark rent, giving him $150 a month for rent to help cover utilities. They were passing the time listening to sports on the computer. They would do some online poker. John Green will tell you that he was, while he was there, he was trying to play for a satellite, they call them satellite tournaments or buy-ins for the World Series of Poker. You can do those online. John's also going to tell you that Mark, at that time in his life, was really down on life. He was down on everything, is the way that John put it. He was sort of angry about everything. It was sort of this constant tension of him complaining about things. And John will tell you that what he tried to do was to try to get him to calm down and forget about it, to let it go. In particular, there was a problem that he had with his father, that Mark Koster had with his father, where he felt that his father had somehow cheated him out of some money. And he would go back to this incident repeatedly while John was staying with Mark. Mark's response was always the same, or excuse me, John's response was always the same. You gotta let it go. It doesn't do any good to stew on it. And that would just seem to sort of upset Mark more. And so it comes to pass that one day while John is listening to the baseball game, he's at his computer, out of the blue, Mark had been complaining that day about his father. He'd been complaining that John hadn't cooked the chicken right for dinner that night. And John had been doing his usual tactic of trying to diffuse it, say, let it go. You can't keep dwelling on this stuff. Out of the blue, Mark comes at him with a baseball bat, and he strikes him in the shoulder. And at that point, the fight is on. John is telling him, stop. He springs up from his computer table. He's shocked by what has happened. He knocks over his computer. They struggle for the bat. It's at that point that Mark does get hit with the bat. The state has said in their opening statement that this, they want you to view this as somehow he's got the bat away from him and he's taking a big league swing at Mark, knocking him to the ground. But John explains in detail to the police, and he'll tell you how this struggle ensued. It was a struggle over the bat, and while that was happening, he managed to hit Mark. They struggled over towards a table. They fell on top of the table. The table was broke during this struggle. And you're going to see the pictures from the basement when the police do find Mark Koster's body. That broken table was down there in the basement, just where John Green put it. And that supports what he's saying. Physical evidence that police found supports this version of the events. So the struggle ensues to the floor, and it is at that point that in defense of his own life, in defense of serious injury, as the law allows you to do, he did kill Mark Koster. That was not murder. And the state talked a lot in jury selection. And they mentioned it here in the opening statement, that we may never know the reason why this happened. Well, the reason that they may never know it is because they don't want to accept the truth. The truth is that he defended himself, and that was the only motive that was going on. And the reason they say they may never know that is because if you don't accept that, there's nothing to show that there was any other motive for this going on. There was no financial motive. Yes, John Green had some financial troubles, but there was no suspicious activity in Mark's bank accounts. His brother testified he didn't squirrel away large amounts of cash. So there's no motive. He's certainly, you're going to see the evidence, he's certainly not behaving like someone who's up here in Iowa to plot a murder. He's out walking his dog. John has a little Pomeranian dog when he comes up here to visit Mark. Takes the dog on walks up and down the street. His car is parked at the residence. He talks to the neighbor. The state wants you to believe that this is, that he's using some alias while he's up here. And really there isn't a whole lot of evidence for that. The neighbor, Sandra Deernville, who the state has listed as a witness, and I believe that they're going to call as a witness, she stated that he very well may have introduced himself as John. She just couldn't really remember, and because the name on that note was Tom, well then that's just kind of a possibility that she put the name on was Tom. So the real question is, obviously, why go to these lengths afterwards? He's acted in self-defense. So that's the question that obviously comes to your mind is, shouldn't you, if you're defending yourself, as Mr. Smith said, you call 911, this is your good friend, or you call the police and say, hey, I was attacked. And John's going to tell you that he made some bad decisions after this happened, but it was, he was in a state of shock, essentially, that his friend, who he had known for 30 plus years, even though they hadn't been in close contact all of that time, would suddenly do this to him. You're going to get some medical records that we believe are going to show you that it is absolutely consistent with his medical condition, his mental health condition, that he would be the first aggressor in a situation like this. You'll see the notes from the doctors and the nursing staff, and it's going to talk about how his chronic paranoid schizophrenia, this serious, debilitating mental illness, affected him. And the evidence also supports that. Mr. Smith talked about, you're going to hear this, that Mark Coster was frail. It was because his schizophrenia was getting bad. He was not in a good place mentally. And that's what the officer's own investigation showed, and you're going to hear that during the interview of John Green, that the officers recognized that the situation here could very well be self-defense. And Mr. Smith talked about them propping up Mark's mental health. They don't have to prop it up. The evidence is what the evidence is. In fact, Sandra Dierenfeld, the neighbor who the police interviewed and who I believe you'll hear from, she talked about the fact that she felt that John Green was there to help Mark Coster with his mental health. He was obviously deteriorating, and the way that they interacted, it was sort of a caretaker role. Okay? So that's really what I'm going to be asking you to look for in this evidence, because that is evidence of a lack of malice. Okay? That's one of the elements of murder, is that you're acting with malice. You talk about actual hatred or intent to do unlawful harm. That was not John Green's intention in all of this. Okay? And you're going to see that through the evidence. Obviously, he made some bad decisions after the fact, but the mental states that we're talking about, premeditation, malice aforethought, those all deal with the mental states that were leading up to these events. And people can make mistakes after the fact, and that doesn't mean that they're guilty of murder. One of the things that the state wants to concentrate on here is that there's this 2-minute struggle. They're pulling that number. The defendant does mention it, but nobody knows how long this happened, not even John Green. He was not looking at a stopwatch as this happened. And that's something that you're going to have to use your common sense on, that in a situation like this, that a situation of shock and surprise, that you're not going to necessarily know all these details, so that when the police do come to you and ask you about these things, you may not have the most accurate of answers. And that's this 2-minute figure. You'll hear from Dr. John Thompson. He's the medical examiner. He's different from the John Thompson who's the police officer. There's 2 John Thompsons in this case. They spelled their name differently. One of them is the medical. But what he'll tell you is that in a situation where someone is being choked or strangled, is that they can die very early on, not from lack of oxygen or anything like that, but from what you would call immediate cardiac arrest or sudden cardiac arrest. In other words, they'll have a heart attack because of the struggle. So could this have been 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes? Absolutely. We don't know. They want to make it as long as possible. You'll hear from their evidence. But we really don't know that. I'm going to ask you to be aware of what the witnesses are saying about that. Be very careful about how that evidence comes into your mind, because it is important. When we talk about self-defense, that idea of responding with excessive force or going away if you have the opportunity to, that does apply. One of the things I think that you'll hear from the judge, and ultimately it'll be up to the judge to tell you what the law is that when you're in a place of safety, though, you don't have a duty to retreat, okay? And John Green was in a place of safety. He was in his, at that time, his residence. He's paying Mark Coster rent. You'll hear that. And I believe that the judge will instruct you that he didn't have a duty to retreat at that point. Now, obviously, the interview is going to speak for itself, and we'll hear from Mr. Green on these topics. One thing that I'm going to ask you to keep in mind is a concept that we talked about in voir dire, and that's the concept of the heat of passion. Because even if you find that John Green wasn't justified, which I believe he is, I think you do have to consider as an alternative that his response to this was done out of the provocation of Mark Coster. That it wasn't done out of malice, that it wasn't done out of hatred. And he may have made mistakes afterwards, but clearly this is not murder. Again, we talked in voir dire, jury selection, about what makes a good juror, and the ability to keep an open mind, not prejudge this case and listen to the evidence. That's what's going to make a good juror in this case. I'm going to ask you to do that, and I think that if you do, I'm confident that